Welcome everyone to this Reimagining World Order Colloquium. This is a colloquium that we've had over the last year and a half. Alas, it's been virtual, not in person, but it's been an enjoyable series nonetheless. It's a series that is hosted by PIIRS and the program on Reimagining World Order, which I run with two great postdocs who are on the line, Tolya Levshin and Chika Tanuka. And we at the Reimagining World Order program do lots of different things. We have an annual conference, we have workshops, we have a podcast, and other activities that bring us together as an intellectual community, probing the big questions of world order, past, present, and future, focusing really in an interdisciplinary spirit, crossing boundaries, history, political science, and beyond. And so today we are really very excited to have as a guest Professor Daniel Gorman, who will be our speaker today in the World Order Colloquium. Dan is professor of history at the University of Waterloo and at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Many of you know him and his work. He's been very, very prominent and productive over the last decades, writing in the area of intellectual history and global governance. A lot of the work focuses on the early 20th century. He has several books that are quite well regarded, International Cooperation in the Early 20th Century, and the book that I've really appreciated over the years, The Emergence of International Society in the 1920s. Another book, Imperial Citizenship, Empire and the Question of Belonging, and two forthcoming volumes, one on Uniting Nations, Britons and Internationalism, 1945 to 1970, and then an edited book on, I think, the prehistory of UN Sustainable Development Goals. So he comes to us today with a lot of work and a lot of fascinating research and writing in this area that intersects international society, history, and intellectual development in the global system. So Dan, we're very excited to have you here today. I'll turn things over to you. Dan will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we will invite questions and comments from our group here. So Dan, the floor is yours, and welcome virtually to Princeton.
Thanks, John, for the introduction and for the invitation to come and speak to everyone. Some of you I know, and some of you I hope to meet in the Q&A. I was joking with Toila before we started that this is a nice respite from some of my day-to-day duties. Now I become our department chair, perhaps under duress this year. So this is an hour and a half where I don't have to pay attention to my email binging at me to sign something or put out some fire. So things can burn on the home front for, for an hour and a half. What I wanted to do today, or at least what I had suggested I would do, is to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done over the past 7 or 8 years or so on international society, sort of to historicize that concept. And then towards the end to kind of connect that to some of the things that I've done in the last couple of years and that I'm sort of thinking about at the moment in terms of what connections and or cleavages, discontinuities we might see between the earlier and the later portions of the 20th century. So I'll share my screen here and as John said, talk for about 35-40 minutes, and then we can open it up to questions, and I'm very interested to hear what people might have to say. Okay, so the title of the presentation that I had suggested is Building World Order, Networks of International Cooperation in the Early 20th Century. So obviously that's a broad sort of remit, and I'm not going to in any reasonable fashion obviously sort of engage with networks of international cooperation in a tremendously detailed sense in a half an hour or so. What I wanted to sort of draw our attention to is the title Building World Order. So one of the things I'm very interested in is how world orders come to be, how are they created? Have actors in the past consciously worked and endeavored to build world orders, to maintain world orders, to challenge and or overturn existing world orders and so forth? And or do we see historical instances or periods where either there are no world orders to speak of, or where world orders perhaps develop organically or even by mistake? Are there particular historical junctures where there's simply a confluence of both structural and sort of individual factors that give rise to something that looks like and functions like a world order for a short or even a longer period of time? So that was kind of that was the big question that drove me to think about a lot of these things. So to kind of flesh out that research question, and here's just the abstract that I had sent along for the advertising. What I want to talk about a little bit this morning is, first of all, do we see in the late 19th century and the early 20th century the emergence of an international order based on interconnected patterns of organized multilateralism and transnational cooperation? All of us, and I'll talk about some examples of this in the next few minutes, but all of us can, of course, point to dozens, if not hundreds of examples in the later 19th and early 20th century of forms of international cooperation, people working across borders, signing treaties, advocating for change, whatever the case may be. Those are all, of course, historically important in and of themselves. Putting them together, what I'm interested in, or what I have been interested in, is the degree to which those forms of international and transnational cooperation were organized. So were these networks that were consciously created and maintained by different actors, and or were they patterns of connection that developed, again, organically or sometimes even by mistake? So to kind of get at that argument, or at least to suggest that as a hypothesis, and this is, I've really, moving into the stuff I've done more recently on the second half of the 20th century, I'm really still at this question stage, having thought about this vis-a-vis the later 19th and early 20th century. I have no clear answer to this, and I'm not sure some sort of an overarching argument or conclusion is possible given the complexity of this. But I've found myself asking similar questions for the post-45 world. So for the later 19th and early 20th century, what I've been really struck by is that there are many historical processes of international convergence. So I'll talk a little bit about international social activists, forms of functional and technical integration, and various forms of international legal cooperation. And even though on their own terms, they were very different issue areas, different actors, different states involved, and so forth and so on, what, at least in my view, links a lot of that activity in the later 19th and early 20th century is that we see processes of convergence, sometimes consciously or by choice. So actors are seeking out like-minded individuals and organizations in other countries or other parts of the world to pursue common causes and so forth and so on. But also because there are broader structural factors at play, or developments and processes at play in this time period, that are encouraging and sometimes perhaps even forcing convergence. So when we talk about, if you will, a historical era 1.0 of globalization, lots of us point to this time period as an earlier historical moment of globalization, technological and communication revolutions and so forth and so on. So a lot of the metaphors that we use to talk about our own age were used, sometimes literally the same ones, in this time period too. So this idea of convergence and what that actually meant in terms of leading to the creation or formation of international orders. So how will I do that? I've got 5 was my favorite number apparently when I put together the presentation. So here are 5 points that I'll kind of work through relatively briefly this morning. So first of all, before the First World War. The First World War is, of course, a classic transitional moment in the history of international relations, in the history of international cooperation, and many more topics beyond that. I'm not going to discount that interpretation, but I want to suggest that some of the developing international networks of cooperation that at least I have identified, but I think that we can identify historically, transcend the First World War. So that even though in many ways, of course, the First World War is a dividing point, it is a singular catastrophe on its own terms, and it does change lots of things. But at the same time, we see lots of continuities from the age of internationalization. Internationalism is not created, of course, in the later 19th century, but lots of continuities between the internationalization processes and developments that we can identify in the later 19th, early 20th century, and those that we see after the First World War. So I'll suggest that the First World War, at least in terms of histories of international society and cooperation, was more a catalyst for the expansion of international society than it was an origin point or again, a point of cleavage or division between a pre-war era and a post-war era, and so forth and so on. And then I'll talk a little bit about international cooperation in the 1920s, some of the reasons that international society I would see to have contracted in the 1930s. It doesn't disappear, but it contracts, it takes on different forms. In some ways, if you will, it goes underground. And then conclude with a few thoughts on the question of, was international society a Eurocentric phenomenon? The answer to that is yes. But I want to talk a little bit, just to finish up, about why I think that's the case and what that might suggest for thinking about international cooperation going forward through and after the Second World War. So, not just to plug old books that nobody's going to buy anymore, but I wanted to place some of the kind of scholarship that the talk today draws on in, of course, the much broader community of scholarship by historians, by social scientists, by people across a wide range of disciplines who are thinking about these issues. I've, of course, just contributed 2 little pebbles to a massive, pile of scholarship, if you will, and 2, not just specific books, they are important in and of themselves, but I wanted to kind of place what I'm talking about today in connection to what other scholars are doing in fields that I think are particularly relevant for thinking about international cooperation. So first of all, of course, the idea of international society is not mine. Many, many people have used this concept, both historians in a more kind of empirical or almost positivist sense. Is there an international society in any particular historical juncture? What does it look like? But also, of course, from English school scholars, Hedley Bowl and Adam Watson and Martin White and on and on and on, thinking about the idea of international society as some sort of a holistic way of thinking about the nature of international relations. So, and I don't want to get into the weeds here, but the idea of international society as sort of a position between international systems, so a much more systemic analysis of international relations, and English school scholars' idea of a world society. So there's lots of overlap there, obviously, both within the English school itself. But for my purposes as a historian, I'm interested, or I was and am interested in those English school ideas, not so much on their own terms. Those are interesting too, and I find it interesting to place them in histories of international relations in an intellectual history sense. But I'm interested in the degree to which historians, or at least this historian, can use some of these ideas and not so much kind of apply them to the past to sort of test them to see whether or not the theory holds up on its own terms. Again, that's an interesting and important intellectual pursuit. It's just not the one that I'm engaged in. But the degree to which international society provides us with a concept and language for thinking about, again, how and why forms of international cooperative networks emerged at this particular time. So taking that idea of society, do we see modes of interaction? Do we see patterns of interaction? And specifically for the question I'm asking this morning, do we see conscious forms of multilateralism and transnational cooperation that emerged in the later 19th and early 20th century that would allow us to frame it as a society. So can we actually speak of a growing international society in these years? So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So, and this is entirely coincidental, but that's why the boat on the emergence of international society is apparently sailing into Hedley Bull and Adam Watson. But if we look on the other side, the international cooperation folks in the parade on the cover are moving to the right. Maybe that's progress, maybe not, but it's pointing to, and this is what I tried with only baby steps perhaps to do in the red book here, is to think more broadly about ideas of international cooperation outside of, if you will, a more conventional or traditional transatlantic world. So I think historically, international society and international cooperation in this time period was Eurocentric. Not in a normative sense that those patterns were somehow better than what was going on elsewhere or are models that we should uphold or whatever the case may be, but that the intensity of internationalism was denser in the transatlantic world, it seems to me, than it was in other parts of the world. That doesn't mean, however, that what's going on in other parts of the world is less important or that people there were being acted upon. And that's what people like Michelle Loru and Carolyn Stolta and others who are writing, whether it's on the League, as you can see in the book here, the League Against Imperialism, or many, many, many other historians and social scientists who are writing about international orders outside of that transatlantic world. So whether that's in South Asia, whether that's in Latin America, whether that's truly global anti-colonial networks, we can only understand, just as an aside, why we have alliances of Irish and Indian anti-colonialist actors in the 1920s and 30s if we think globally. And there are innumerable examples or cases like that. So more and more scholars are thinking about truly global histories of international cooperation and international order, and thinking about how they fit together and or don't fit together, or clash, perhaps is a better term, in the past. So these are some of the big picture things that I've been thinking about, trying to connect some of the work that the presentation this morning is based on and some of the things that I've been doing in the last few years. So I would suggest again that the late 19th and early 20th century and a previous era of globalization and all of the ways that we see that as being the case in our own modern period. And for purposes of international cooperation, I think that's important because globalization and increase in globality, if we want a definition, or at least my definition, led in this time period both to more intense international conflict. We don't, of course, have a world war in the later 19th century and then before 1914, but not a year goes by in that time period where there are not dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of smaller scale conflicts in the colonial world and regional conflicts. So this is by no means a peaceful era, except at the global or the systemic level. So we have more intense international conflict and at the same time, more intensive international cooperation. And those are not necessarily developments that were, if you'll pardon the pun, in conflict. So what does that mean on the ground, on the historical ground, if you will? Well, again, if we think about international cooperation, the early days thereof, again, an early era or a previous era of globalization. So these are structural factors that for me seem to have conditioned forms of more intense, international cooperation. So we can use lots of symbolic sort of starting points. I've just chosen Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. We could look at the creation of lots of our International Public Bureau, our International Postal Union, our Telegraph Union, and so forth from the 1860s forward, and on and on and on. But what the historical record, if you will, seems to suggest is that we have an intensification of forms of international cooperation. They're not new, at least not all of them are new. Many of them build on older models. And she may be here today, but I think you had Glenda Sluga earlier in the fall talking about the Congress of Vienna and so forth and so on. So it's not as if even the forms and patterns of international cooperation that emerge in the later 19th and 20th century are necessarily new. What I think is new, or at least historically significant on its own terms, is the intensification of internationalization. We have more and more international public bureau. We have more and more transnational networks of activists or whomever, and so forth and so on. So what does that look like? Again, if we look at this time period as an earlier age of globalization, the question is, therefore, why did internationalism develop in this time period? Because they're not necessarily coterminous. We can have an increase in globality without a coterminous increase in internationalism, and vice versa. So I think, and maybe this is just to provoke some conversation after, but I think that in some ways, Norman Angell, in his Great Illusion, was actually correct. Not in terms of predicting that growing interconnection, especially on the economic front, would make war almost inconceivable because it would be in no one's interest, but that his diagnosis was correct. Because after all, he was making that argument based on supporting arguments that are the same that I'm making this morning. That the world that he was writing about in the early 20th century, he saw as one of growing interconnection. The conclusion he drew was that therefore would mean that war was much less likely, that war was an illusion. The original title of that book, when it's first published in Britain, The Optical Illusion, I think captures even better his argument. But the idea that war was a fool's errand, that internationalism or internationalization would actually be a prophylactic against conflict. We know that that's not right, but as I'll show in a few moments, I think in some ways his diagnosis was still correct, because many of the forms of interconnection that he wrote about continue through and after the First World War. So I'll come back to some of that. And here just on the screen, again, the number 5, magical for me this morning, I guess. Just a few reasons I would suggest that we see a rise in internationalism in the later 19th and early 20th century. So again, our technological revolutions lead to a demand, a requirement for common standards. These are our railway gauges across borders. These are the development of the International Postal Bureau to send letters across state borders, and on and on and on. Intensified state sovereignty. So when we think about a nation state system developing, this is of course certainly in the European world, but even more broadly, the time period where nation states are becoming nation states in the way that we think of them today, that governments are assuming and securing greater control over the administration of their territory, raising taxes and so forth and so on. One of the corollaries of that development is that this created the potential for threats to trade. So we have, at the same time as nation states are developing, a growing consciousness, at least amongst some actors, that unless there are agreements of some sort, even if it's just agreements not to come into conflict, then trade, our mutual interests, could suffer. And flowing from those first two reasons, just the basic idea that economic integration leads to mutual interests. This is our European Unionist argument. This is our David Matranis and our Ernst Hasses, and you know, the idea of integration, that ever deeper integration leads to ever deeper integration. And we can see a lot of those ideas being put forward by some of our internationalists in the later 19th and early 20th century. And at the same time, we see transnational cultural connections deepen, and so forth and so on. So in the later 19th century, and again, this is another list of 5. These are not the only forms of international cooperation one could identify, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. But I think we can point to humanitarian forms of international cooperation. This is Henri Dunant, who comes, you know, across famously the Battle of Solferino and leads to the creation of the Red Cross and so forth. This is a period of cultural internationalism. I've got an image of the Paris exhibition in 1900 on the screen here. But this is also, of course, the age of the first modern Olympiad in 1896 and so forth and so on. This is a period, and here's our globalization argument again, of great functional and technical internationalism. So our telegraph here, even the Paris exhibition, as this postcard is showing us, was stunning amongst other reasons for its mass electrification. Electricity itself, one of the drivers of internationalism in this time period. Lots of forms of progressive internationalism and legal internationalism. So just to unpack a few of those. Our Red Cross, of course. And I love this image. Many of you have probably been to the museum here, which is, I think, one of my favorite museums that I've had the good fortune to visit. But that absolutely fascinating database of index cards that the Red Cross created in the First World War to connect prisoners of war in all countries to their loved ones at home. And Red Cross actors acting as the intermediaries there. And that's a phenomenal achievement that was only possible by implementing some of these ideas and ideals of internationalism, I would suggest. The very idea that the Red Cross branded themselves or presented themselves as apolitical, and therefore could interact with belligerents on all sides of the conflict. Cultural and functional internationalism. So again, lots of our public unions, many of which still exist today, our international telegraph union and so forth and so on. Our International Sanitary Convention from the 1890s, particularly important in our age of COVID. Also, again, our forms of cultural interaction or internationalism. So I saw this morning or yesterday in the news that a Chinese spokesman has come out and criticized the World Tennis Association for pulling its events out of China in protest of the treatment of Peng Shuai, the tiny Chinese tennis player, stating that the Olympics should not be politicized. Now, they have their own reason for making that announcement in the current situation, but of course, the Olympics have always been politicized. In fact, Baron de Coubertin, who's on the screen here, and others created the modern Olympics for explicitly political reasons, that they were to be a vehicle of peace and so forth. Lots of forms of progressive internationalism. I've just got the International Council of Women on the screen here this morning, but I could have put lots of others up here. And what I find particularly interesting about many of these international, or perhaps more specifically transnational sort of activist networks, is that they are really alliances of like-minded actors around the world. Now, the world, in the case of the ICW, as you can see by the fact that there are only 9 original nations represented here, is a circumscribed one. But as I'll show in a few minutes, there are many other transnational associations and movements and alliances and so forth that develop in this period and then in the interwar period that are larger than just transatlantic. So this idea of drawing like-minded actors from around the world, sometimes aligning with, but other times transcending national interest, is again a development that we can see intensifying in this time period. And finally, legal internationalism. And certainly in the United States, this is one of the most prominent forms of international cooperation in the later 19th and early 20th century. But again, of course, not solely an American practice. So a lot of our discourse about the law of nations, about positive law, our conventions, our treaties, and so forth, as well as natural law, many of the norms and informal conventions that underpin legal agreements. This is where we get arguments about the standard of civilization underpinning world order in this time period, of legalized hegemony, the idea that our largely Western actors are creating international agreements and applying them to other parts of the world whose inhabitants had no say in creating them. And of course, here's where we see race be important. International relations as a discipline, and this is a generalization that doesn't, of course, always apply in the particular, but international relations as a discipline has sometimes tended to overlook, not necessarily intentionally, but overlook questions of race. And I think if we look at histories of international cooperation in this time period, we can see how important racial identities and racial hierarchies were in underpinning certainly much of our natural law that constituted the law of nations in this time period. The standard of civilization is not something, of course, that was written down, at least as such. It was sort of the accumulation of lots of explicit agreements buttressed by the many social and cultural prejudices and assumptions and so forth and so on of that time period. So legal internationalism often in this time period was universal in claims, I would suggest, but particular in practice. And we can look for examples of that in the Hague conferences in 1899 and 1907. Here on the screen, I've just given us the most sort of oft reproduced image of the first Hague conference. And of course, the practice of international arbitration, which was particularly attractive to American internationalists. The idea that one could apply some of the principles of mediation at work in the private sector to international relations. If we can solve contract disputes by going to mediation, perhaps we can do the same. We can send international disputes to binding arbitration. So we get that in whether it's the Alabama case in 1872 or lots of other examples of international arbitration up until the 20th century. So for the last few minutes, let's shift to the interwar period. And as I suggested a few moments ago, I think the First World War was both a cause and a consequence of internationalization. So to flip that around, I guess I should have it the other way around on the slide. It was a consequence of internationalization because, and here's again the argument that Norman Angell, at least in his diagnoses of the international system in the early 20th century, I think he was correct, that the First World War was a world war. Not just because European states internationalized it through their empires and we end up with fighting like is shown on the magazine cover here in Tsingtao in China or whatever the case may be, but because the war was made possible and the way that it was fought and then ultimately the way that the peace settlements unfolded was only made possible to a degree by the processes of internationalization and international cooperation that I talked about before. So what does that mean for the interwar period? And here's where the First World War, I think, was a cause of internationalization going forward. It led to intensified imperial internationalization. So our European empires don't fall, at least not all of them, through the First World War. And of course, at least territorially, they reach their apex after the First World War. But they're not the European empires of the late 19th century. They are run more and more like some of the international organizations and networks that we see emerge in the later 19th and early 20th century. So the interwar period I find really interesting in terms of imperial history because empires themselves became internationalized. Actors are increasingly learning from each other about how, from their perspective, to best run an empire. We see individuals moving between international organizations and colonial services and so forth and so on. So, of course, empires have always been international by their very nature, but empires, at least in my view, took on a very interesting form in the interwar period as the shifting international system around them forced them to adapt. We see, in the most literal sense, an increase in international organization in the interwar years. I don't have a chart or a table here, but we've probably all seen visual representations of the growth of international organizations, formal international organizations and other institutions in the interwar period. And of course, that's spurred by the war, the peace settlement, and the various problems, as I'll show in a moment, that emerged out of the war itself, that at least in the eyes of some actors in the interwar period, seemed to encourage or perhaps even demand international responses. And then finally, and tied to the first two, I think we see an increase in private transnational cooperation at the same time, and for some of the same reasons. So what does that look like? We often tell the story of the interwar years that orbit around these two individuals, and more broadly, the political ideologies and worldviews, and indeed visions of world order that they advocated. So of course, Lenin and Bolshevism, by its very nature, an international political project. So even though Stalin will go on to solidify the revolution first in the Soviet Union, by its very nature, Bolshevism and then communism was an international, of course, political ideology. So this is one version, of course, of self-determination. Then, of course, famously Wilson as well. So the, if you will, Pandora's box of self-determination that is in a explicit sense opened by these two individuals and the many others, of course, in their train, is important. But again, I would suggest not necessarily new, and not, I don't want here unintentionally to caricature arguments, other arguments that suggest that they were new. They weren't, and I don't think anybody makes that argument. But I think it's important for us, again, to stress the continuities here. We have anti-colonial movements stretching far back, well, throughout the history of empires, for that matter, that are being picked up by both of these individuals and broader advocates of these visions of self-determination, in the sense that they're anti-colonial. But I'm more interested in patterns of continuity from the earlier period that I just talked about. So I think there are a number of reasons why we see international society, as I wrote some years ago, emerge in the 1920s. I think if I was to, I won't do this, but if I was to retitle that, I might say accelerate or intensify or something to better stress or portray the continuities that I see from that earlier time period. But I think there are a number of reasons why we see intensified international cooperation in the interwar period. An expanded international moral consciousness driven in part by the war. So I find the image that I have on the screen here really striking. Here we have a Japanese Red Cross member. So a Japanese member of an international organization, a transnational sort of organization created in Europe, delivering aid in China in a war that was started by European powers. So this seems to be a nice image that kind of draws together a number of these developments. A desire for peace, leading, of course, to international institutions. This is the sort of well-known and I think quite convincing argument that coming out of the war, there are many people advocating for increased internationalism as a means of preventing another war. We have the legacy of wartime logistical cooperation and technological innovation. To fight a global war meant to build on those practices of internationalism that had been developing in previous decades. So I'll give you just one example, the Allied Wheat Board. Unless you're really into the history of agriculture or something we don't perhaps read too much about, but the Allied Wheat Board was a fascinating sort of logistical development to get foodstuffs shipped between the Allied powers, to make sure that people who were suffering from the ravages of war could get food sent to them, and so forth and so on. And the Allied Wheat Board gives us just one of many examples of how some of the logistical developments on an international scale that the First World War encouraged were picked up on by actors afterwards and applied, if you will, to quote unquote peacetime. The war produced humanitarian crises no single state could solve. This is our typhoid crisis in Eastern Europe. This is our displaced persons crisis in the Middle East, and so forth and so on. And then again, we've got our imperial powers expanding their global networks. And here's an argument that I'll perhaps float sort of as a trial balloon, because it's not something that I concluded in any of these works, that I'm still thinking through going forward into the later 20th century, that I've thought for a long time about the question of whether or not the First World War and the attendant processes of globalization that emerged from it created a single international system. So coming out of the First World War, either literally or at some historical point in the early 20th century, can we begin to speak of a single international system? In other words, an international system either that actors across the world all buy into, that's quite unlikely, or more likely, an international system that all actors around the world were forced to participate in whether or not they wished to. and if they wished to change it, had to change it from within the system or oppose that particular system. Lots of people have written about those big picture questions. I have nothing, I don't think, particularly new to suggest along those lines per se, but that's one of the big picture questions that I've sort of come out of some of this research thinking about. So to finish up, I just want to give a few examples of some forms of international cooperation coming out of the First World War into the 1940s, and see where there are some continuities with pre-First World War forms of international cooperation, and then maybe where some of this history can take us looking further into the 20th century and closer to the present. So again, number 5 here: communication, sport, pacifism, humanitarian relief, and the international ecumenical movement. So some of you will have read some of this stuff if you've looked at some of the books. This is my favorite example. This is the first form of interwar international cooperation that I looked at for a different project that I was doing. I can't even remember what it was at that point. And I was fascinated by this. Radio, right? Wireless. This is one of the great technological developments of the early 20th century, if we're talking about globalization in that era and so forth and so on. And it creates a fundamental problem. How do we allocate this natural resource, the electromagnetic spectrum? We can't all broadcast, right, on the same frequency. We don't listen, we listen to Spotify and stream stuff and so forth today, but of course, those of us who continue to or remember listening to the radio, right? You're driving around and you get static, and as you go from town to town, you've got multiple networks broadcasting on the same frequency and so forth and so on. This is a fundamental problem, and it's a fundamental problem that nation states understood and that they came together in 1926 to negotiate a solution to. And thinking about international cooperation, the solution that was negotiated at Washington in 1926 was fascinating, at least to me, and that is not to allocate the electromagnetic spectrum along national lines, which is what was pushed by some actors, but by service. So I know the font is a little small here. You can get lots of variations of this table online, but this is still the table that is used today to allocate the electromagnetic spectrum. And the various other technological developments in more recent times have been added to this. So for instance, you can see sort of in the middle to the left there, that there are frequencies set aside for distress signals broadcast from ships at sea, for instance. There were lots of examples, including the Titanic, of ships in the early 20th century that could not send out distress signals properly because there was interference on the frequencies that they were broadcasting on the side of people who might have been able to send help. So there are lots of forms of functional cooperation. Again, I've talked about cultural interactions and so forth, and those only intensify in the interwar period. So we've got our first World Cup in Uruguay in 1930 in terms of international sport. We can talk about the internationalization of empire by looking at, amongst many other examples, the first British Empire Games, which were held in Hamilton in 1930. And again, these are in and of themselves small or even trivial examples, but international support or international sport supports arguments for intensified internationalization in these years. So you can see Percy Williams, the fellow who's winning the 100-yard dash on the top right of the screen. He could only do that in the Empire Games, because when he went to the Olympics in 1928 in Amsterdam 2 years before, he ran in the 100 meters. So one of the things that occurs in the interwar period, just in the world of international support, is a standardization of rules, of distances over which particular events were contested, and so forth and so on. After all, you can't, right, have an international sporting event if everybody's playing by the same rule or different rules. So again, just another example of internationalization affecting, in this particular example, sport, but different people's different walks of life. Pacifism. This slide maybe will draw questions. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, the Paris Peace Pact, the General Treaty for the Renunciation of War as an Instrument of National Policy. to give it its formal name, is both, I think, a quintessential example of international cooperation in the interwar period and the oft used example of the fallacy, the failure, the weakness of international cooperation at the same time. But I think it's important, whether or not we think it was successful on its own terms or not, because it did establish a normative prohibition against aggressive war. That's why some of the German accused at Nuremberg were charged with conducting aggressive war. And that's why I think, not necessarily literally because they looked at this treaty and then decided they needed to somehow do an end around, but this is why Japan stages a Marco Polo Bridge incident before it launches an intensified attack in China. This is why Germany stages a border skirmish with Poland instead of just rolling tanks in. That's what it did on the ground. Why did it go through the pretense? I don't want to overestimate the importance of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. There's a wonderful book by Una Hathaway and Scott Shapiro that a number of you have probably looked at that really gets into the Kellogg-Briand Pact. But I think it's an important marker of pacifism and the outlawry of war movement in the interwar period. We've got our Nobel Peace Prize winners. You can see a number of them here. We've got various forms of humanitarian relief in the interwar period, again, organized in response to some of the crises that emerged from the First World War, whether that be genocide and ethnic cleansing, whether that be the problem of mass displaced persons, and so forth and so on. And what's really interesting about a number of these international humanitarian relief efforts is that they were what we might today see as public-private initiatives. States are involved, international institutions. Here's the League sponsoring aid being sent into Siberia for needy folks there. And then individuals. So whether it's the Dane Karen Yep or many others who were private individuals and activists, all working together in the same way that the international community does today in the aftermath of a hurricane or whatever the case may be. One of my brothers-in-law is a consultant for the UN, and his team produces and maintains programs that coordinate the logistics of aid donors. So when there's a hurricane and thousands of people all around the world are donating money and supplies, then it's important to make sure that there aren't only bottles of water sent, and that there are also blankets and food and so forth. So we can see the origin of some of that in this time period. Our international ecumenical movement, here you can see some of the leading figures there, including Dieter Bonhoeffer. The contraction of international society in the 1930s. And again, here are just some examples of international cooperative institutions and actors that continued their activities through the 1930s. That's just one striking example. Even though Japan walks out of the League in protest over the League's sanction of what the League certainly sees as its invasion of Manchuria, Japanese actors continued to cooperate with the League's social commissions. And finally, to conclude, and this is the Eurocentric question, as a lot of my examples this morning suggest, I think international cooperative networks in the late 19th and 20th century were to a great extent to be found in the transatlantic world. That most of the faces on the images on my slides were white. Most of the national backgrounds were European or North American, and so forth and so on. But I think it's important not to kind of overdetermine that evidence, because as I suggested off the top, I think there are lots of different forms of international cooperative networks that we see all over the world, of course, and many of them begin increasingly to make themselves known both in opposition to and separate from these forms of international cooperation I've talked about so far. So whether that's the Central American Court of Justice, the world's first permanent court of international justice ahead of The Hague, whether that's Pacific-based institutes of different forms, our League Against Imperialism, and so forth and so on. So a few concluding questions, things I'm thinking about at the moment coming out of doing this research and looking forward to the second half of the 20th century. I'm really interested in whether or not we can speak of international society or societies, whether the one that I've tried to talk about this morning or any international society, as a world order. Do international societies in and of themselves constitute a form of world order? Or sometimes, are they simply a feature of all world orders? Do all world orders have forms of international society embedded within them? And perhaps if that's the case, it's a question, certainly historically, for assessing the density of those forms of international society, the actors and so forth and so on. And then finally, and this is the stuff I've been doing in the last few years, how did early 20th century forms of international cooperation, either the ones I've talked about this morning or the many, many others that many other scholars, such as some of the ones I had on my slide earlier, have written about, how did they shape the post-1945 world order? And John and many others have written about, that liberal world order that emerged from the Second World War. So to what extent is that, or was that new, or these new ideas, or at least pre-existing ideas that had not been kind of road tested before, if you will? And to what extent were they either continuations or new variations of older forms of international cooperation put to either the same uses or to different uses? So these are big open-ended questions for which I have no clear-cut answers, and many, many other people, of course, both know much more than I do about and have other answers. But I thought I would end with some of these concluding questions to either spark some discussion or at least to let you know sort of, where I've ended up coming out of some of this work. So I'll stop there and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Dan. This has been terrific. Just a sweeping and rich tour of global society, world society across really a century of time and space. I wanted to get started here and just ask a question, and then I maybe turn it over to Tolia to lead the Q&A. But one of the themes that threads through your lecture is the kind of interconnections between what might be called imperial internationalism, the story of empire and how it gave birth to various kinds of internationalisms, and the kind of what might be, at least in the 20th century, a contrary or rival form of internationalism in liberal internationalism. So how would you sort through the entanglements of imperial internationalism, which generated a great deal of activity and standardization, integration on the global scale, and sources of internationalism that were, in some sense, rival or challenging that imperial space? Where would you look, and what would you point to as the types of internationalism that was emerging during this period, that offered alternatives, that were the most important in creating alternative logics of cooperation that would be ultimately subversive of empire? So entanglement versus resistance and rivalry, where do you see that rub? Because you don't really give us a sense. You give us both. They're there, the peace movement, but also the imperial structures. Where is the rub, so to speak, and when does it emerge, and what form of contestation do you think was most important in the movement away from empire and imperial internationalism?
Those are all good, big questions. I mean, one of the things I find interesting about the time period that I talked about this morning, so the later 19th and the early decades of the 20th century, is that, as you suggest, internationalism as sort of a political project, if you will. So how could and or should forms of interaction take place? Was multifaceted. So internationalism itself was not a single political project. It was not a political philosophy that drew certain types of people and antagonized others. We see all kinds of different forms of internationalism. So we see, well, to take us to one extreme, for instance, there scholars like Madeleine Heron and others have in recent years published lots of really interesting stuff about fascist internationalism. That seems an oxymoron, perhaps, at first scan, but it reminds us that even forms of nationalism and extreme nationalism were internationalized. So we see not just alliances of, obviously our Axis powers, alliances of fascist powers, but moves by different fascist actors at different times, especially in the 1930s, to internationalize their particular form of politics. And we can even see fascists capture some of our international institutions. Interpol is a good example in the later 1930s. So one of the things that's really struck me is that internationalism or internationalization was less a political project captured by or advocated for by particular camps, but an activity, if you will, an initiative, a set of initiatives. So our empires, I think fundamentally, if we just think about them coming into the time period I'm talking about, and this would go back farther in the past too, but empires are fundamentally international. The whole point of empire is to govern across spaces that go beyond national borders. So many people have written about, it's the task of governing at the frontier. It's the task of governing non-citizens and all of those tasks that are extensions of, but also sometimes separate from the more established practices of, if you will, domestic governance. And those are international activities. So when we talk, or at least when I talk about the internationalization of imperialism, especially in the interwar period, for me, it doesn't seem so much that something fundamentally different is going on. It's that our imperial actors, by and large, again, not in every example, but our imperial actors, by and large, were adapting some of the tools, practices, and outlooks of internationalism, as I've talked about this morning, and applying them to the running of, and increasingly the justification of, empire. So Mark Mazur and lots of other people have of course, written about how the UN itself has within it, the legacy of imperialism that, whether it's Jan Christian Smuts or lots of our UN figures who are coming out of this imperial world. And to us looking back, when I teach Smuts to students, that they just can't they can't understand how he could be both an internationalist and a precursor of a white supremacist state. That just doesn't fit together, but that's only because we're looking at it from our perspective, of course. For figures like him, those are simply two sides of the internationalist coin. So our liberal, more rules-based, rights-based, multilateral world, I think, is emerging in lockstep with, sometimes in opposition to, but in lockstep, or at least parallel to, the internationalization of imperialism. And as an example, I would point to the fact that we have some of the same individuals. Again, if we just look at the British Empire, I was, Toyla and I talking before the talk this morning, the Lionel Curtises and the Philip Carrs, the Lord Lothians, and all of those imperial federation folks in the British Empire that in the first decade of the 20th century, as very young men, wrote the draft of the Constitution of the State of South Africa, go on to pop up at Versailles in the British delegation and start to sort of apply some of those older imperial ideas to the emerging international space. So those are just a few examples, I guess, of what I would see as some of the entanglements at this time.
Tolia, do you want to
Thank you. For the audience, please use the raise hand function if you'd like to be added to the queue. And then when it's your turn, I will ask you to unmute yourself and you can put your question directly to Professor Gorman. Dan, I would like to start with a question of my own. And then I also have two questions from Professor Moravchik here that I will ask for him. My question has to do with the effect of these ambiguous conflicting pressures of globalization that you talked about, globalization increases the capacity for conflict, but it also increases the capacity for cooperation. This is something that we find also in Raymond Aron and Stanley Hoffman, that this kind of feature of globalization is very well familiar to scholars of international relations. To what extent do you think these conflicting pressures of globalization lead to the, we can sort of say loosely, evolutionary selection of particular institutional forms, of particular architectures of international order, and especially in the context of imperial governance? Do you see decolonization as sort of the inevitable culmination of these conflicting pressures of globalization? Or do you rather see the emergence of imperial internationalism in the 1920s as a sort of an evolutionary adaptation to these new niches that are created by the conflicting pressures of globalization? And if so, do you then see decolonization as rather sort of a contingent failure that could have been avoided with subtler, craftier forms of international governance? I put this to you. Would you also like to take Andy's questions right away, or?
Just let me know yours. I can do yours first, and
Okay.
then I'll come back. Yeah, I mean, that's really kind of, or certainly one of the big picture questions that I've been interested in all along, that I'm still interested in, both in terms of applying them to this time period I talked about today, as well as you suggest, the post-1945 world. One of the things I find really interesting about the development of international institutions in a more literal sense, in terms of organizations and so forth, as opposed to, you know, institutions understood more broadly, like law or what have you. But that is the form and structure of international institutions that develop in the later 19th and early 20th century remain relatively consistent as we move further into the 20th century, which, thinking back, we can understand many reasons there, that there's organizational inertia, you know, that there's sort of a Darwinian process at play where the success or apparent successes of particular institutions therefore condition what later ones look like, and unsuccessful ones die away, and so forth. But I think it's also interesting because it shows us that at least some of the crises of the second or of the 20th century, certainly the first half of the 20th century, did not, at least in my view, and I certainly stand to be corrected or reminded of other examples here, but did not seem to have given rise to fundamentally new and different forms of international institutions or cooperation. They seem to give rise to different forms, often on a major and a significantly, you know, reoriented or fashion, but it's the same type of institution. So the standing bureaucracy, you know, the standing bureau in Geneva and Brussels and so forth, you know, created in the 19th century because those were good sort of tax settings for such places, and they were subsidized by you know, municipal and state governments and so forth. I mean, there are very practical, logistical reasons for why bureau pop up where they do, but that idea of a permanent headquarters and a secretary general and an international organization as an information clearinghouse, and on and on and on and on, that proved, I think, for many people to be a very attractive institutional form and a very adaptable one. So again, even the League, right, coming out of Versailles, in many ways is, and indeed literally in some cases, but was a drawing together of many of these previously disparate international activities, international cooperative activities. Looking forward to decolonization, I mean, certainly, I think we could imagine or envision a counterfactual past where certainly decolonization happened differently and was perhaps mediated through international institutions, at least on its own terms. I'm not making a normative statement here, but more efficiently for all involved. But at the same time, you know, whether it's, again, our League Against Imperialism or the many other either anti-hegemonic or parallel sort of international cooperative networks in our global south of today, it's very hard to see how many of those actors would have all come into the international institutional tent, because for at least some of them, that international institutional tent had emerged from the very empires against which they were resisting. So this is stretching the argument, I think, beyond what I have any certainly evidence or thought that I've given to today. But if we go forward to our G77 in the UN or NIEO in the 1970s and so forth and so on, we can still see those tensions between, international actors who are, who are not benefiting from the status quo, trying to use the status quo to achieve their aims or to forum shift out. And we can go back maybe to the institutional world that I'm talking about here, maybe for the origins of that world.
Thank you. And now to two questions from Professor Andrew Moravchik. Professor Moravchik wants to know more about the kind of the latent theoretical story underpinning your account. And his first question is about whether or not your account is basically just a functional explanation of international cooperation in a general sense. So are you basically saying that social cross-border interdependence, whether driven fundamentally by agents pursuing idealistic or material goals, drives institutionalized policy coordination? Is that the essence of your story? He's asking this because it seems like a lot of the examples that you've given seem to sort of fall under this rubric. And if that's not the account that you're going for, then why would you say is it the case that only some forms of interdependence appear to give rise to institutionalized cooperation and not others? Professor Moravchik here cites Cohen's analysis about how interdependence that gives rise to collective action problems, which can be resolved through the reduction of transaction costs and the provision of information and so forth, are the ones where we do see the emergence of institutionalized cooperation. Would you agree with that? Or do you have some alternative explanation for this difference between different forms of interdependence giving rise to different densities of institutionalized cooperation? Thank you.
I can probably answer that in a minute or two. No. Yeah, I mean, those are really big and important questions. Maybe to back up just a little bit, one of the things that I've become very interested in over the years doing this historical work is the way that the history of international relations theory, as well as attendant other social science theory that scholars over time have brought to bear on these types of issues, has itself evolved. So that's not something I talked about today, but I'm interested, why, to talk about functionalism, for instance, why is it that, a David Matrani, the Romanian economist who makes that argument in the 1930s, why is he making that argument then? Well, in part, he's working at the UN, working for the League of Nations, that he's involved in some of those functionalist, what he certainly saw as functionalist activities at that time and so forth. So sort of working as a historian, I'm kind of doing it back to front, right? That I'm, at least what I'm doing, I'm interested in, and this is a cliche, but I think it's true, the history on its own terms. I'm interested in why the people I'm writing about acted and thought as they did. And then, as I tried to suggest with the English school stuff, just very briefly at the start of my talk, in part through the attendant interest along the way in the historical evolution of international relations theory, I've become very interested in how historians, or any of us doing historical work, because history is a banquet for all, we can all work historically, whether we're in a formal department or not. But how can we draw concepts and theory from neighboring disciplines and think historically without doing violence to the theory itself? So in other words, not just cherry picking conceptually and applying it historically. Sometimes that might work on the surface level, but so that's kind of the prelude. In terms of the question itself, to a certain extent, yes, I think a functionalist interpretation, not in all examples, and again, I only gave some examples here today, and there's a danger, like with any project, of selecting the evidence that seems to support the argument one's making. And especially with something like international cooperation, I've also found myself over the years having to fight against the temptation to see it everywhere, right? It's like the man with the hammer who sees a world of nails, right? international cooperation can mean lots of different things, and you can find it if you go looking for it. So it's less a matter of, did people cooperate across borders? Yes, of course they did. That's not ground shaking argument. It's how and why and how much did they do that. So I do find functionalist arguments, if not more persuasive than others, certainly very influential in shaping at least this work that I've been doing. But I would add to that that one of the things that I find quite interesting for many of the actors that I was writing about at this time period, and this is, I think, a conclusion that can be applied to other historical time periods, is that it's not so much, or it's not just that we see international cooperation along functional lines where there are common interests and, and so forth and so on, but also where we see a growing consciousness or awareness of those common interests. So retrospectively looking back, we can of course identify lots of common interests. We can even sometimes apply common interests to historical actors who may not have seen themselves as having them. And if that was the case, then that was not the reason for why they might have been cooperating. Climate change is a wonderful example. Climate change, as scientists define it today, of course, has been happening, well, for time immemorial, but certainly in our Anthropocene era, at least for a couple of hundred years. But what's interesting to a historian, at least this historian of international cooperation, is how and why was climate change something that international actors only really from the 1970s forward, and really in an intensified way in more recent decades, have come to position and define and sort of cooperate about as a common interest problem. So if we apply that same logic back to the time period that I'm looking at, why does the international peace movement emerge when it does? Why do we see some of our international kind of technical or functionalist cooperative networks emerge at the particular points where they do? So, I mean, I think it's an obvious argument that increases in globalization lead to technical cooperation. What I'm most interested in is, what did that relationship actually look like, if you will, on the ground? So that's, I guess, some thoughts along those lines.
Thank you. I'll remind the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I will come to you. Chica, please.
Thanks. I think my question in some ways builds on some of these discussions, but I also want to ask you about your conception of international society. And in particular, whether you see internationalism as a style, a form or means of doing politics and organizing affairs, or whether it's also a goal. There's a particular vision of international society that actively seeks to transcend international interests, whether that's also got to be a necessary condition for some movement or member to count as part of this international society. And I'm asking this in part because I think, especially when we turn our attention to non-European engagements with international in, say, the 1920s, there are examples of, say, anti-colonial nationalists using the League of Nations, the mandate system, to make claims for national self-determination, right? Or we can think of Japanese imperialists coming to the Institute of Pacific Relations, that kind of new transnational network of private actors and statesmen that in many ways it's very 1920s, it's very much international society, but then they use that forum to advance claims that are extremely nationalist, right? It's all about their special interests in the Far East. So I think these kind of examples, and I don't know whether it's coincidental or significant that these tend to be non-European examples rather than Anglo-American ones, but for them, internationalism distinctively a means, but definitely not an end. And I wonder whether you would include those in your definition of international society, or they fall outside it. And is there something about that in a way where you see the roots of unmaking of the international, right, just because of this kind of conflict between end and means?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the answer is different depending on what historical actors we're talking about, of course. But across the board, I mean, I at least having done this work over the past few years, I've come to see internationalism and international cooperation more as a means than an end. So, so what I mean by that is that it is a means of doing politics. It is a means of organizing political interactions. It is a type of political space, sometimes literally in terms of the late 19th century development of permanent international bureau, with dedicated staff and so forth and so on. That's more of what I'm doing in the last year or two in terms of the UN project, and who actually worked for the UN in its early years. That was the basic research question of the recent book that I did. Where did all those people come from? What were the visions, amongst other things, of international society that they brought with them from their pre-1945 or whenever they come to the UN world into the practices of international governance after 1945? In terms of internationalism or international cooperation as a goal, I think for some actors it was, but where it was, they were never necessarily clear about what that meant. So what does collective security mean? What does the end of war mean? What does increased functional efficiency mean? How do we actually measure these things? How does one know when one has achieved the goal and what have you? And this is where, maybe to go back to John's question off the top, ideas of liberal internationalism become important, because it seems to me there, for our liberal internationalists, yes, I think it was a means of doing politics too, but there is a goal there. There is whether it's sort of the Pareto efficiency, a version of a world order, that this is a world order based upon rules, based upon multilateralism, based upon rights, and so forth and so on. But a lot of the tension, a lot of the intermingling between different forms of internationalism, I think can, as you put your finger on, be put down to some of this, differing visions about whether or not it was a means or an end.
Thank you so much. Tolia, Chika, I just wanted to join with you to thank Dan for a terrific session. We have covered a lot of territory here, and Dan, you've just been terrific. We've been so happy to have you here, and I hope this is a conversation we can continue, but I want to join with everybody online here to thank you for being with us today, and everybody stay safe, stay well, and we hope to keep the conversation going. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the discussion.